Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Ryan O'Neill.
And the first question for Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower, our regular Tuesday guest. How's the snow over in Alfred this morning, Dr. Ostrower?
Well, we have about 12 feet of snow here. You know, it's really pretty good. We have about 3 or 4 inches, I would say. The roads have been plowed. The village does a very good job on that kind of thing. But, things are slippery, and some of us are not going to be making longer trips that we had anticipated. But, hey, this is winter. I heard Jonathan a few minutes ago saying that, while this is not going to melt the polar ice caps, I just wish that people who argue the case for no global warming, it's kind of taking up Trump's his position, that it's all really a hoax. I wish they would understand the difference between weather, which is what we have today, tomorrow, the next day, and climate, which is what we have over the long term. I think that most of us realize that the climate has been warming and very, very significantly warming, and it's going to be probably the greatest single challenge that all of us are going to confront in the next 50 to 100 years. Now, because it's very, very gradual, this kind of thing is not happening overnight, there's a tendency to ignore it. But there was an interesting study by a scientific group fairly recently that said something to the effect of 150 million people are going to be, now this is globally, but 150 million people globally are going to be forced out of their homes where they live in places like, surprisingly, Iraq, in Egypt, around the Nile Valley, but also through areas such as Bangladesh and a number of other areas in Asia and whatnot. And when you talk about 150 million people being, forced out of their homes, you got to ask yourself where they're going to go, and it's going to intensify the immigration problem that all of us are facing right now. These are big, big issues, and it's going to cost a lot of money to deal with this. Not the least of which is even in our own country, where we may not have that kind of a flooding, except for perhaps in Miami and New Orleans area, places like that. But for coastal communities that are going to have to, as best they can, protect themselves against rising seawaters. It's going to cost a lot of money, and we are all going to be forced to pay for this in one way or another if we don't come to terms with the reality of global warming.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, okay, on that topic, and there's so many things in this day in history I do want to get to, but conservatives have argued for years that the environmentalists have been crying that the sky is falling on this, that, and the other topic, and this argument against the environmentalist movement goes back to the 1970s. And you have the conservatives, as they often do, criticizing AOC, saying that the congresswoman, the downstate congresswoman, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is a doomsdayer when she says that there's only 12 years left. What do you say to the conservative argument that the environmentalists have been crying wolf for too long?
First of all, the environmentalists have not been crying wolf. The environmentalists have been saying, in general, and again, that covers a large group of people. But for the most part, the environmental movement is fairly, not fairly. It's very, very much, I think, in sync. There is a consensus, if you will, within the context of the environmental movement that there is going to be very, very serious global warming. It has our climates have already warmed. In the last 19 years, that is from 2000 to 2019, we have had 18 of the warmest years in recorded weather history. I think that that's something that all of us should be concerned about, and that's not just whether it's happening in Hornell or in Alfred or in upstate New York. We're talking about global trends. In Paris, for instance, they had the warmest day in Parisian history this past summer. That tells you something. Again, one shouldn't worry about a particular one particular day, but when we see this kind of a pattern globally, then I think we have to take it very, very seriously. And when I say there's a consensus, about 98% of all, 98% of all climate scientists are agreed that we are facing global warming. We see it in the melting of the polar ice caps. We see it in the melting of the glaciers in Alaska, in the glaciers in Glacier National Park right in our own country, and certainly in the Himalayas. These things are going to have, and are already having to a certain extent, very, very serious implications. It's leading to unrest in areas of Africa where food supplies are diminishing because areas that were very fertile are now becoming increasingly desert because of the heating effect. And so, instead of complaining about AOC, who's a distraction, I mean, she's really not important at all. Instead of complaining about AOC, and instead of complaining about the environmentalists, one ought to take seriously the environmental science. Now, if people reject science, if they are, like the president, largely contemptuous of the scientific community, then I don't know, where we're going to be. But when 193 countries have signed on to the Paris Climate Accord, and only 2 countries, namely Syria and the United States of America, have essentially rejected it, I think it tells you something about the degree to which we are isolating ourselves and the degree to which the conservatives who are complaining about environmentalism are really all wet.
Dr. Ostrower, the big story this morning, and I do want to get to the question about Nikki Haley and her statements about John Kelly and Rex Tillerson. But the big news this morning, though, is that former Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick is looking at getting into the race. Not critics, but news anchors are pointing out he might be a little late for that. Your thoughts?
Well, I don't know very much about Deval Patrick. I mean, I think the Democrats have a weak field at this point. No one has really, kind of convinced everyone else that he or she is capable of defeating Donald Trump in a sustained campaign. And so now you have people like Bloomberg, and you have people like Deval Patrick, and perhaps you're going to have people like, I forget his name, the former Attorney General under Clinton, who are going to argue that, perhaps there's room for them. There are others who are worried, of course, that, maybe Hillary Clinton will get back into the race, or maybe Michelle Obama will join the race. It's hard to say. I mean, it's very, very late at this point for anyone to get in, to get into the race. But, from my perspective, the real story these days is not, who the Democrats are going to run, although, that's going to sort itself out in the next few months. It really has to do with impeachment. It has to do with something that has happened very, very rarely in American history, and something that is very, very clearly outlined in the Constitution of the United States. And it was an impeachment clause in Article Number 2 of the Constitution, also Article Number 1. There's 2 separate clauses there that speak to, in a sense, exactly what has happened in Washington, where the President of the United States has essentially extorted the Ukraine, has extorted another country, essentially saying, you dig up dirt on on my opponent, and in return, I will provide you with $381 million worth of military aid. Brian, we have never seen that kind of thing before. That's called bribery, okay? There's no other word for it. You can use the term quid pro quo, you can use the word extortion, you can use the word holding them up. It's bribery. And in Article Number 2 of the Constitution, it says that the President and other officers of the United States can be impeached for and convicted of treason, bribery, that word is right there in the Constitution, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And the President can say that he didn't do anything wrong. He could say that there was no quid pro quo. He can then say that, well, there was, but everyone does it, or that there was a quid pro quo, but that he had nothing to do with it, or that it wasn't a quid pro quo because the Ukrainians didn't know that the money was being withheld, which of course turns out to be false because they certainly did know that this was going to happen. The President has changed his tune. He's offered so many different variations of his defense that it's bewildering at this point. And I think that among others who are bewildered are the Republicans who keep trying to defend what is essentially indefensible at this time. We're going to hear a lot more about this when the impeachment hearings begin, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, they may begin as early as tomorrow.
The conservative argument, one of the arguments against impeachment, is Trump supporters don't believe the accusations against the president. Conservatives say when the vote comes in November of 2020, the Trump supporters will still be there for him. Your thoughts?
Well, they probably will be there for him. You know, I saw on a TV program recently, maybe it was at a Trump rally, people wearing T-shirts, Trump supporters wearing T-shirts, and the T-shirt said, "Read the transcript." Well, first of all, the transcript isn't a transcript as such. And it says right on the top of what we're calling the transcript, it says, "This is not a transcript," okay? It's a recollection by a number of others who had heard the telephone call. So let's call it a transcript, even though it's not really a transcript. Secondly, if you read the transcript, it says exactly what I indicated before, namely that you do us a favor, namely you dig up dirt on Vice President Biden in return for which we will, we're going to give you this money. It's spelled out. The president himself at one point had admitted it, but then he said, that everyone does this sort of thing. So, you can listen to Fox News, which is essentially a Trump broadcasting organization right now. It's kind of the equivalent, if you will, of what Pravda was in the Soviet Union years ago. And if that's the only source of information that you have, you're going to believe what they say. If you tell a lie often enough, people are going to believe it. But the fact of the matter is that transcript is out there. There are going to be people this very week who are going to be testifying in Congress who are dedicated public servants, people who are not Democrats. They are not Republicans. In some cases, they were appointed to their positions in Ukraine as ambassador, talking about William Taylor, by the Trump administration. They are going to spell this out, and I would just hope that Trump supporters are going to listen to this with an open mind, open enough to say, hey, there is something going on here, and I ought to take this seriously.
Nikki Haley's statements about John Kelly and Rex Tillerson, and Rex Tillerson's denial of Haley's accusations.
Well, it seems to me that we have had a fair amount of information leaking out over the past 2.5 to 3 years that not only Tillerson and General Kelly, but others also have tried to protect Trump against himself. They have removed papers that they were fearful he might sign. They've tried to, in other words, protect him against some of his own worst instincts. The fact of the matter is that, one shouldn't be surprised that Kelly and that Tillerson were doing what Nikki Haley is accusing them of doing. But the way she accused them is kind of odd. She doesn't say, for instance, in her book, she does not say that she then approached the president to tell him about this. It seems that she wants it both ways. She's suggesting that, the president might have bad instincts at some points, but by the same token, she's loyal to him. And I think what she's really angling for, and I'm not the first person to say this, Nikki Haley wants to be the vice president of the United States. She is hoping that the president is going to dump Mike Pence the next year and is going to select her as his running mate. And the reason the president may do that, I think there's something to this idea, is that the president is very, very weak when it comes to, and I'm talking about the election of 2020, the president needs the support of American women. And he's going to get more of that support if Nikki Haley is on the ticket than if Mike Pence is on the ticket. So I think that she's playing a very, very clever game. I think it's a dishonest game. And I think it's one of these things in which she is really in some ways discrediting herself. She said as recently as this morning on one of the TV programs, she said that she has never heard the president lie to her. She's essentially, I don't know how to put it other than to say that whoever the president touches, he corrupts, okay? People who are good people who are honest people who have a moral backbone, somehow or another cave when it comes to their relationship with him, perhaps because they're so fearful either about their political future or because they want so much from him.
We're going to take a quick break and come back with Dr. Gary Ostrower in just a moment, and we'll do This Day in History. Stay with us.
The DJ you should hire listens to you about the kind of party or reception you'd like to have, pronounces your name right, plays the music you request, not the songs he feels like hearing. The DJ you should hire works out the songs ahead of time with you. Sean Stewart, DJ Truth, for all occasions, weddings, dances, graduations, anniversaries, and parties. 661-7658. 661-7658. 661-7658 for Sean Stewart, DJ Truth.
Checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carolyn. Rob, on the Empire Report, I see it says Buffalo area sets record this morning.
That's right. The airport yesterday in Buffalo picking up 5.2 inches of snow, the most amount they've ever had for Veterans Day. And I know much of western New York sitting underneath about 6 to 10 inches of snowfall. The amounts have been lighter as you've been working your way further east, Brian. We didn't get the enhancement off Lake Erie and Lake Ontario like they did out there in Buffalo. But certainly early to have snow on the ground, and it will continue to snow this morning as this cold front continues to work its way through the eastern United States. Radar continues to show some light snow right now from the Finger Lakes back across the southern tier to the east side of Lake Erie. So light snow will taper off to snow showers, additional accumulations under an inch. A winter weather advisory remains in effect through 9 this morning. Temperatures are going to be quite cold today, only getting up to about 25 to 30. This time of year we're supposed to be about 45 to 50. We'll have clouds tonight. Could see a stray flurry or snow shower come through. Overnight, bitter, 10 to 15. Tomorrow will turn partly sunny, but we remain cold. Arctic high pressure stays in control of the weather. Highs tomorrow, 25 to 30. Clouds tomorrow night, it's 15 to 20. Clouds on Thursday, maybe a flurry, milder, 35 to 40. Another cold front's going to move through on Friday, Brian, and that's going to put us back below normal for the upcoming weekend.
Rob, we've been hearing on the different shows throughout the morning, like Gordon Deal, that this is a huge storm. Not a huge storm, I would say, for the Canisteo Valley area, but for parts of the state, as we said earlier, places like Buffalo, it's pretty bad.
It is, and Brian, the big story is not only the snow that's fallen with the system around the Great Lakes and over portions of the Northeast, but there's actually been some snow as far south as Tennessee and Virginia, and it's also the cold. The cold is very expansive, stretching from Montana and the Dakotas down towards the Gulf Coast and into the Tennessee River Valley. By this time tomorrow, it's likely some of these cold temperatures are going to be as far south as northern Florida.
Thank you, Rob. Back with Dr. Gary Ostrower. This Day in History, November 12, 1954, a very famous place, Ellis Island, where the immigrants often first came in from, was it mostly Europe, Dr. Ostrower? Ellis Island closed in 1954.
It's all Europe.
Yeah, I would think so, just, based on the geography of it.
If you are Italian, if you are Irish, if you're Jewish, if you're Russian, if you're Greek, in all likelihood, your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents came to the United States via Ellis Island. It was opened up, I can't remember the exact year, but about 1880. It remained open for the next 60 years or so. It was the main entry point into the U.S. And so there were quite literally millions of immigrants who came in via Ellis Island. It was closed in the 50s because the number of immigrants coming in from Europe had diminished so much. And the reason it had diminished is that back in 1922 and then again in 1924, the U.S. Congress, based on a lot of nativist kind of sentiment, had really turned against immigration. And the immigration that they turned against was not so much immigration from Northern Europe, from England, from the Scandinavian countries, and even Germany, but rather from Southern Europe and from Eastern Europe. And the fact of the matter is that an awful lot of Americans back in that period were anti-Catholic. As a matter of fact, the Ku Klux Klan had reached a membership of in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 million Americans out of a total population of only 100 million. In other words, 3 or 4% of the entire population was in that organization. And the Klan during the 1920s was not mainly anti-black. It was anti-immigrant. It was anti-Semitic, and it was anti-Catholic. And so the restrictions, there were quotas, if you will, that were imposed on immigration from the Catholic countries of Southern Europe and from Eastern Europe, like Poland, and also, of course, from the Far East. So it was simply that Ellis Island no longer had the need to process as many people as it had before World War I, when we had a completely open immigration policy. I think, if I'm not mistaken, 35 million immigrants from, roughly speaking, the end of the War of 1812 until 1922 had come into the United States, many of them through Ellis Island.
A couple this day, there's a lot in this day in history. There's 1979, Jimmy Carter, President Carter shuts down oil imports from Iran as a response to the then hostage situation. There were 66 Americans being held hostage in Iran. The other big story, 1969, Seymour Hersh, a longtime famous journalist, breaks the, and forgive me if I'm not pronouncing it right, My Lai massacre story. Dr. Ostrower, which one?
Well, on the My Lai massacre issue, it's kind of interesting. Seymour Hersh, back in 1969, was not well known. He was a very young journalist, but he had gotten the story. He had gotten the story from a young photographer who had been in the service, who knew secondhand about what happened at My Lai. Hersh then investigated this, discovered that approximately 500 South Vietnamese civilians. Now, these are South Vietnamese, not North Vietnamese. So these are the people supposedly on our side. But that approximately 500 of these civilians had been killed by American troops from the Americal Division. And it was a big story. What happened is, interestingly, is that the young man, his name is Ridenhour, the photographer who had first, kind of uncovered all of this and publicized it, really did not receive much of a hearing. He went to Congress. Congressman blew him off. He went to some newspapers and so forth. They didn't take it very seriously. It was not until he wound up contacting Hersh that the story really became national. And it was, of course, a real black eye for the United States. In many ways, it further discredited a war that many people had already felt should never have been fought in the very first place. But I also should mention that there were other My Lais, smaller My Lais. There was a case, for instance, not far from Saigon, where a number of Marines had killed approximately 20 to 25 South Vietnamese civilians. There would be a court-martial there. I met the man, as a matter of fact, I taught a course on the subject of the Vietnam War, and I had the Judge Advocate General, the highest-ranking Marine legal officer, who had prosecuted that case in our class, and he talked about it, and he talked about it in ways that were certainly very, very, highly critical of men who, in the Marines at that time, who had really, not, if you will, followed, not respected international law, which, among other things, says very, very clearly, you do not kill civilians deliberately. Collateral damage, that's one thing, but there was nothing collateral about this. This is the deliberate killing of those 24, 25 South Vietnamese civilians.
And Seymour Hersh was famous for another big story that he broke in May of 2004, the torture at Abu Ghraib. Yeah.
Look, Hersh won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting of My Lai. And from that point on, he was often the point man when people had stories that they felt, should be publicized that were otherwise being covered up. They often went to Hersh. And that was not the only thing. There were other stories still that he was involved in. He was absolutely, and is, I shouldn't say was, he's still alive, a top-notch supporter. I should say top-notch reporter. And the issue of Abu Ghraib, again, discredited the American military. It was a story that, it had to do, of course, with torture in a prison just outside of Baghdad. And it was, what can you say? Torture is torture. We have domestic laws. Our Constitution says, in the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution, no cruel and unusual punishment. And unfortunately, cruel and unusual punishment was inflicted against some of our enemies in Iraq during that period.
With that, we have to go. Dr. Ostrower, as always, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me here.